Hi. So we are still looking at crop protection, but now we're looking at the forms of control that we can bring for our weeds and our pests and diseases. Right, so our first thing we need to look at are types of control which we have. So we have three methods that you're going to need to talk about: cultural control, chemical control and biological control. And lastly, we need to look at this in terms of integrated control. Okay. Right, so what we mean by cultural is traditional non-chemical methods. Okay, so these are methods of control that have been used for dozens and dozens, hundreds, thousands maybe of years, but it's basically just good farming practice. What you need to do is talk to the people who actually know what they're doing. So there's all sorts of things that might have been done for generations, like maybe doing controlled burns, what types of things you put in which fields, how long you leave fields fallow, things like that, which we only realise once we have looked at the science why it's effective, but the point is that they are effective. So you've got to talk to the people who really understand it and not dismiss traditional practices, because actually a lot of them have really good basis in basically empirical science, but with not actually understanding exactly why. And if we can understand it, then maybe we can apply it different places. So the cultural methods which you need to know. So for a start, ploughing. Okay, ploughing has a lot of good reason behind it. It's not just to give you nice straight rows to plant your things in, although that helps now with harvesting and stuff like that. What it does is, in terms of control, turns the weeds underneath, and that means that it stops them growing. And on top of that, you actually get some extra plant material into the soil, and that's really helpful as well. When you are preparing the fields, okay, so traditional ways of doing that, so sometimes as well as ploughing, you'll get them being fired, and what that means is that you can burn off residue that's there, and that could get rid of things like the fungal spores and things that we were talking about before, and it'll get rid of hopefully some seeds that were there from weeds, and this can be a really effective way of preparing fields. And also you get the combusted material gives you ash that can be quite good in terms of a fertilizer. There are obviously other environmental impacts to the side of this that you have to consider. Okay, so if you're doing geography, you may have looked at this specifically, slash and burn farming with the Amerindians, which involves small areas being burnt down, used as their farm for a short space of time, and then as the nutrition is lost from that soil, they just move on and leave that area to be retaken over by the rainforest. That only works in small sections, but it works really well. So again, from the know your soil, know your field, if you know exactly when you should be planting, and that seems like a silly thing, but genuinely really important. If you know that certain plants, if you plant them, say in January, it means that the weeds that would otherwise be growing in February, obviously January, February was a stupid time to say, let's say March and April. Okay, so if you get them in to get a head start before the weeds that would normally be starting would be in April, then they're good. You know, they've already established, there's no space for anything else to come in. So also cultural, knowing which weeds you need to get out early. So if you know the ones that are likely to seed, the ones that spread really fast, the ones that as soon as you spot them you have to remove, the ones that you're like, you know, I can get back to that next week, that's okay. It means that you know exactly what you need to prioritise. Again, any good gardener will know this, but we're talking on a larger scale for food production, so it's essential that the farmers are really clued up on this. Okay, so you can also consider what's surrounding your crops, because you could effectively you can produce something like a fire break. If you have particular weeds which only grow in particular conditions or next to particular things, the monoculture would be a big issue. But if you can have two fields separated by, say, another field, or with a different crop in it, or by your hedgerows, or by small copses of plants, you know, all of these things could be useful. Okay, so you have to consider everything, not just the field, but what's round about it. And one that you may have heard of, crop rotation. Now, that means that you can take a plant, and you may have heard about this in the nitrogen cycle from Nat 5, because what you have with some plants is they remove productivity from the soil. In fact, all plants will do that, especially if you stick with one plant, because that plant's just going to keep on taking out exactly what it needs, and over time is going to reduce the soil kind of profile for how good it is. But if you have certain other plants, and in particular we're talking about legumes here, legumes will add back in nitrogen in particular into the soil, so they are really, really important. So this would be a kind of traditional crop rotation set that you would start off with something, a root systems, and then you've got potatoes and that kind of family, and then you've got legumes, and then you've got brassicas, and then you just go back round. And each of these, running each of these, allows the soil just to recover each year, and also allows some replacement of good nutrition. What you're also hoping to do with crop rotation is to break the transmission from one year to the next for pests and diseases. So if you have something which, say, particularly likes potatoes, and you've grown potatoes in that field for the year, but then the next year you grow potatoes again, then that's now become endemic to that field. It will just remain in that field and keep on staying there. But if, however, the next year you grow, say, broad beans, and it doesn't particularly like broad beans, then it's basically lost. Okay, it doesn't survive that year, and you've broken that transmission. Okay. Okay, so if we move off culture and go to chemical, we are going to use sides. A side is something that means kill. So we've got our kind of obvious names. Some of these are more general than others. So like a pesticide just kills pests, but a molluscicide is killing mollusks. And so you can be narrower, you can be wider in your definitions. So some basic stuff about the sides, and in particular we're looking more at herbicides than anything else in these ones. Okay, so you can have selective herbicides. Now these are quite impressive in some ways. They only kill certain types of plants, and the way they only kill certain types of plants is if you have, most of our crops are going to be cereal crops, so their leaves are up and down like this, okay, but a lot of the weeds are kind of big, broad-leaved, kind of low-growing. Okay, now what happens with these selective herbicides is in the plants which we are growing, the herbicide falls, but most of it just skips past these leaves because they are flat, they're straight up and down. But these guys, when it falls onto the leaves. All of these gets taken up into the plant, and so the plant gets killed. Okay, so it affects broad leaves more often than the narrow pointy leaves, and so it's selective. Okay, and that's really helping to pick and choose what you kill. We also have non-selective herbicides which just basically knock out all plants, and obviously that's not going to be good for our crop plant, but it might be good for preparing if you want to just remove everything to start with. So also on the herbicide side, we can talk about contact herbicides, which means that they need to literally contact the leaf surface and then they move through. But what's more common is that they are systemic. Now, systemic can be used for herbicides, and we can also talk about systemic molluscicides and systemic pesticides in other ways. Okay, so what we mean by systemic is that they move through the whole transport system of the plant. Okay, so most systemic ones will go in from the ground and then up through the transport system and through the whole plant that way, and then kill off everything. Or you could have ones that are soaked in from the surface, move into the transport system in the top of the plant, and then move through it. So they're going through the whole system of the plant. Okay, and the same would be true of your insecticides, which are systemic. So they're going to move through the transport systems of the insect. Okay, so something kind of nasty you might have in the garden. This is a contact and systemic and non-selective. Okay, so the problems are many, but some of the big ones are to do with two of the properties that we would talk about. Okay, persistence and toxicity. Okay, so what we mean by persistence is how long it remains in the system. Okay, so if it is degradable, so if it breaks down, it has low persistence. Okay, if it stays around for a long time, it has a high persistence. Okay, what we also have is toxicity, so how much you need to be there to kill something. Okay, now the combination of these will decide how much damage they can do in an ecosystem. So the first thing that can happen is bioaccumulation. So if it's persistent, so it doesn't break down, then what happens inside the organism is that over time, so this is just, in this case fish, swimming about, they just build up more and more and more of the chemical. And because that chemical is not breaking down as they take it in, it just stays there, gets bigger, gets bigger, gets bigger, and eventually it can kill them. Okay, so that's bioaccumulation. So bioaccumulation is within one population, within the lifespan of the organism. Okay, even more impressive in terms of what happens, but depressing in terms of what happens, is biomagnification. Okay, so biomagnification is where it goes up in concentration. Okay, so what happens here is, starting at the bottom, you will have a very low level of the particular contaminant. Okay, so think of the producer level. Okay, so if you imagine a producer, so say some algae, which contains one point, like one specific bit of this chemical. Okay, now assuming it's persistent, okay, then what we have is that one piece. If you then have something in its primary consumer coming along and eating, say, 20 bits of algae, then it gets all 20 pieces. Okay, so you've magnified the concentration of that particular chemical. If the secondary consumer comes in and eats, say, 5 of the primary consumer, each of them had 20 bits of this chemical, the secondary now has 100 bits of this chemical. Okay, and if this keeps on going and going, what you end up with is it increasing in concentration up to the top of the food chain. And so what often happens with biomagnification is the toxic levels are at the top of the food chain. Okay, this is really, you looked at it in Nat 5, but just to make sure you're absolutely happy with this system. So our next problem is not to do with the chemicals, it is to do with the fact that what we're doing is creating a pressure. So if you think about your evolution stuff, what we're doing here is we are basically setting up the system to allow resistant individuals to be benefiting. You've produced the pressure for any resistance in the population to be selected for. And so they basically do well because they don't have any competition left, because you just wiped out their own competition. And this is an issue. Okay, so the chemical becomes less and less useful. So our last form of control, individual, is biological control. Okay, so this is really what you had at Nat 5. So if you need to go back to the Life on Earth unit at Nat 5 and have a look back over this, go ahead. Okay, but what we're looking at is having a natural predator, parasite, or a pathogen of the pest that you want to get rid of. That's an awful lot of P's in the middle of that sentence. Okay, so our problems are that we think we might be doing the right thing, but we might get it wrong. So you might put in a control that you're absolutely sure is going to get rid of a particular insect, but then you discover that actually it's impacting on a different type of insect which was not causing any problems and in fact was holding something else in check. There's all sorts of impacts that could happen. If you're using these biological control systems, then obviously they could get out into the wider community. So if you possibly can, it's better to work in a controlled space, so something like a greenhouse, polytunnels, that kind of thing. And obviously with exactly the same issue that you have with your chemical control, you can build up resistance to your pathogen control. So best example of that one is always given as myxomatosis with attempting to get rid of rabbits in Australia. Okay, so we get to our last bit, integrated pest management. So this is the idea that if you know everything about what you're doing, then if you can use a combination of chemical control, cultural control, biological control, and what you're looking to do is produce a managed level, that not necessarily expecting that you're going to remove every single pest, but you can get them to a level which is acceptable. Okay, so you use not a huge amount of chemicals, go for low persistence and very, very careful about exactly when you're putting them on. Okay, you use biological control, specific times, very carefully monitored to try and avoid the risks that were on the last bit. And it is all about knowing what you're doing, which was exactly where I finished on the last presentation. You have to know what's going on. You're trying to do the absolute best without disrupting or damaging anything round about you and your ultimate crop yield. okay? And that's us.